All right, everybody. Welcome to lesson 3 in anatomy and physiology. I'm your simple anatomy teacher, Mr. Grippa, and today we're going to be talking about the mouth and the teeth. So, without further ado, let's go ahead and take a look at that. All right, so the mouth, also known as the oral cavity or the buccal cavity, those are all three acceptable names for the mouth. The mouth is formed by the cheeks, the hard and soft palates, the lips, and the tongue. So remember from the skeletal system that the bone to the posterior of the roof of the mouth was called the palatine bone. So the palate is in reference to that that bone there. The palatine deals with the palate, which is going to be back the roof of the mouth. Okay. Your tongue, associated with together with the muscles that forms the floor of the mouth or the oral cavity, is composed of skeletal muscle tissue covered with a mucous membrane. So your tongue is unique in that it is skeletal muscle. It is voluntary. You have control over it, obviously. But what makes it unique, if we remember from the muscular system, is that all skeletal muscles have an origin and an insertion. Your tongue only has an origin. It does not have an insertion because the end of the tongue is loose and free. You know, you can stick your tongue out. So that is what makes it unique about the one of the unique things about the skeletal muscle that is in the tongue. And there are rumors out there that says the tongue is the strongest muscle in your body. I don't know about that. I think all muscle tissue, skeletal muscle tissue, basically pound for pound, is all about equal. But it certainly has a fair amount of endurance because some of you you use your tongue all day long; it never stops flapping. So anyway, that is going to start us on the mouth and the tongue. The extrinsic and intrinsic muscles permit the tongue to be moved to participate in food manipulation for chewing and swallowing, and also involved in speech. It takes a lot of coordination for speech. You, some of you that have younger siblings may have noticed that if you remember them when they were toddlers and were learning how to speak, you may remember that they understand what you say to them, but they have a difficult time in forming those words back and speaking back with you. And the reason is uh, being able to speak is a very complicated task. It takes a lot of brain power to be able to form words, control your air, control the tension on your vocal cords, and be able to manipulate your tongue in a particular way to form the words that we use. Now, after you learn how to speak, we very much take it for granted and we do it all the time and don't ever think about it. But this is why we have accents. When you learn to speak in a certain way early in age, and that the way you make sounds and the way you pronounce words sticks with you, and when you go to a different part of the world or different part of the country, you may notice certain accents and different dialects, and the reason is because you learn how to make those words, and unlearning that way and trying to relearn is very difficult. And speech takes a lot of brain power. This is why the other members of the great apes that we are related to don't speak. They understand language, but they can't vocally communicate, and that's because they simply don't have the brain power. So that's a little bit about talking and your tongue. All right, so some of you may have noticed that there's a small membrane that lies underneath your tongue that holds your tongue down. That is called the lingual frenulum. It is a fold of mucous membrane that attaches to the midline of the upper surface of the tongue. Sometimes if it's too short, it overlimits the tongue's movement and impairs speech. This congenital problem, called ankyloglossia, is surgically correctable. That word is quite a mouthful. Um, and if it holds your tongue down, think about it. If you try to take a moment here and try to say something without letting your tongue come off of the floor of your mouth, hold your tongue flat to the floor of your mouth and say, "I love anatomy," and we'll see how funny that sounds. All right, and so that's what that has to do with. So you can see here that the lingual frenulum does hold this child's tongue down, and it's a simple procedure. They go in, they give you a little bit of numbing agent, and they snip that little dude right there, and that frees the end of the tongue up and allows them to speak uh, more easily. All right, so talk about the tongue. The upper surface and the sides of the tongue are covered with papillae. Papillae are tiny, what we call finger-like projections, and some of these papillae will contain taste buds, not all. So here is a picture through a scanning electron microscope of the papillae on the tongue. Many of you, if you were able to have felt the tongue of your cat before we left, or if you have a cat at home, you may have noticed that a cat's tongue is very rough. Those are the papillae on a cat's tongue, and obviously the papillae are bigger and stiffer than the papillae on our tongue. So your tongue, if you look at it, if you were to actually zoom in on it, it will be covered with all of these tiny little fleshy spikes, and those are the papillae. All right, the major portion of saliva, we'll talk about the secretions of the salivary glands, saliva. Saliva is secreted by the salivary glands, which lie outside of the mouth, and they pour or empty their contents into ducts or tubes that empty into the oral cavity. And you have more than one pair of saliva. There are a couple of them located in different spots along your mouth, which we'll see here in just a minute. The remainder of saliva comes from the buccal glands. Remember, buccal is one of the terms for the mouth, one of the acceptable terms for the mouth. Uh, from the buccal glands in the mucous membrane, which line the mouth. So there are some saliva is secreted just from the lining of the mouth, but most of it is going to come from those saliva glands. And let's take a look and see where they are. So you have a few. The sublingual is under the tongue. Sub meaning under. Lingual is in reference to the tongue because, when you speak language, it's called linguistics. If you want to talk about language. So sublingual means under the tongue. Submandibular is in reference to the jaw or the mandible. We can see here. So the submandibular, they lie underneath the mandible, and they will help secrete saliva into the mouth. And then the big one that is up around the upper portion of the mandible is called the parotid salivary gland, and it's the largest of all the salivary glands. So those are your three kinds of salivary glands. Again, parotid, submandibular, and sublingual. Saliva lubricates and dissolves food. If you remember from lesson 1, we discussed that its job is to basically mix with the food as you chew it and make that food much easier to swallow. And just before we go too much further, a mouthful of food once swallowed, all chewed up and lubricated by saliva, is referred to as a food bolus. So once that mouthful of food starts going down your esophagus, it is now referred to as a food bolus. So saliva lubricates and dissolves food and starts the chemical digestion of carbohydrates. Now, there's very little acidity to saliva, as we're going to see. It's mostly water, but it does begin very minorly the first path, the first stages of chemical digestion. It also functions to keep the mucous membranes of the mouth and the throat moist. And if you ever had a dry mouth or a dry throat, you know that's very uncomfortable. Okay, we're going to stop right there. Lesson 3 went a little long. Um, Tried to keep it down to 15 minutes, but I went closer to 20. And YouTube will only let me load 15-minute videos. So I can't shave almost 5 minutes of video off. So we're going to stop right here and we're going to divide lesson 3 into 2 sections. So you'll have lesson 3A, which is what you just watched, and then you'll have lesson 3B, which you're going to watch immediately after this one. So go ahead and find lesson 3B and get started on that one. Sorry for getting a little long winded, but you guys know me. You know how I can get. So thanks for watching, and go ahead and go on to lesson 3B.